Hi friends, my name is Jeannie Bowman and I am the illustrator of Bob Marshall, Defender of the Wilderness, which was written by Linda Elovitz Marshall and published by South Dakota Historical Society Press. This picture book is available for pre-order now to ship September 5th, 2023. I wanted to share with you some of the time lapses of my favorite pages and tell you a little bit about Bob Marshall. He was a pretty fascinating guy. Bob Marshall was born January 2nd, 1901. He was an American forester, writer, and wilderness activist. He is credited as being one of the main founders of the Wilderness Society in 1935. He loved to climb mountains. Bob, his younger brother George, and their friend Herb Clark were the first Adirondack 46ers, a group of climbers who climbed all 46 of the high peaks of the Adirondacks on the eastern side of the U.S. He traveled to Alaska and wrote the book Arctic Village, which detailed the lives of the people he met there. He served as Chief of Forestry in the Bureau of Indian Affairs from 1933 to 1937 and Head of Recreation Management in the Forest Service from 1937 to 1939. He worked tirelessly to create regulations to help preserve large areas of roadless land. The arguments he made and the regulations he laid down set the groundwork for the Wilderness Act of 1964, which protected 9.1 million acres of land from development. Bob was Jewish, and he was a huge supporter of socialism and civil liberties. He routinely promoted and argued for minority groups throughout his life. This particular page that you're watching now is where we meet Bob as a baby. Bob was born at a fascinating time right at the turn of the century. In many ways, his life experiences mirror many of our own. Where computers and the internet revolutionized the way we live our lives, automobiles were transforming the landscape of the world Bob inhabited. Mass production and the assembly line were transforming work opportunities, and cities were changing rapidly. Bob was a person with the soul of an adventurer and a person who cherished a slower, quieter way of life than the busy hustle and bustle that he was born into. I wanted to show him here in the midst of it all, taking it in. I painted this entire book in Adobe Fresco, something that's a completely new process for me. Previously, I had only done a few digital paintings, and the two previous books that I illustrated were both done in watercolor. This digital process was fun in a lot of ways, but it was also frustrating in others. I do miss my watercolors when working digitally, but the ease in which you can edit and adjust is pretty much unrivaled in digital. Process-wise, what you will see throughout this video is that I start by using live watercolor brushes in Fresco to create sort of a large blob of color, and then I use the eraser and lasso tool, the little weird black and white squiggle thing that you see leaping around, to cut into it and define the shape that I want. I then use clipping masks and adjustment layers, mostly the multiply and screen, to build details of the thing that I'm painting from there. I won't lie, this spread was quite intimidating to me. I was the one who decided what to draw on the spread, but when it came time to draw it, I was sort of kicking myself a little bit at the start. I usually always have a war with myself throughout the process of making a book. It's sort of like being split into several people. The process of making a picture book begins with the pagination. The book designer splits the book up for me and tells me what words go on which page, and then lays them out in an attractive manner. I start by writing down some notes on what I want on each page, and then I do a rough pass of thumbnail sketches where I decide how the drawings will sort of roughly go. That's when I begin to argue with myself. There are things that I would like to do that require growth for me to accomplish. This is one of those spreads where I knew that I would sort of be sweating trying to draw it out, because I have an understanding of the perspective, but I've not really mastered it yet by any means, and this drawing would be a test to what I knew. And I'm sure if there's any perspective masters out there watching this, they might be cringing here at my mistakes, but I am a recovering perfectionist, and it was important for me to go ahead and attempt to do this spread, goobers and all. Something I am having to learn and relearn the hard way as an artist is that you can only improve by making mistakes and learning from them. After the rough sketch stage, I submitted the work to the editor and the book designer, and we had a discussion about what worked and what didn't. Once we ironed out the kinks, I drew the final sketches, did some quick value studies in black and white, and then sat down to coloring, which is what you're watching now. I love the painting stage the most. All of the hard stuff had pretty much been decided for me, for the most part. And now, at this point, I can just sort of have fun designing light and shadow, which is the most interesting bit for me. Some artists like to move around and complete their painting all at once, where they paint a little bit over here and a little bit over there and so on, and move back and forth between them. But I've tried that a couple of times, but what works best for me is to simply work in a single area and I'll get it almost to the finishing point before moving on to the next. So you see me throughout this painting building things in sections. I go back at the end and add the finishing touches to sort of pull it all together. It's interesting to me watching this time-lapse back while I'm recording this because it condenses 2 weeks worth of painting down into a half hour with, of course, a little bit of editing help by me. Most of that time was spent fiddling with details. I'm the kind of artist who loves little details, and I try to add some to this spread. I actually used Google Maps to find the street where Bob Marshall lived in this book. His residence was listed as number 47 East 72nd Street. You can actually go check it out if you want. Just several blocks down from his house was Central Park, so I wanted to draw Bob's governess taking him and his older brother James and his older sister Ruth for a stroll through the greenery. Now, Bob's home has since been knocked down and another building has been built in its place, but the architect who designed his house actually designed most of the row houses on that block. Where the tree is in this painting is in front of the building that is one of the last 2 buildings still standing from this architect. The other one's on the left-hand side of that building. So it's that brown one and the white one up in the top left-hand corner. I used that beautiful building as a model for the other buildings on this row and imagine what Bob's house might have looked like from there. I've never actually been to New York City, so I really had to rely on my reference images to help me construct these brownstone buildings. I would never have guessed that nonfiction picture books would be the sort of work I would be doing when I started thinking about a career in illustration. I grew up very interested in fantasy and fairies, and I used to actually try to hunt down fairies in my backyard as a kid. And all of my artistic endeavors have revolved around creating a world that's as magical to me as that of Brian Froud's. And if you don't know Brian Froud, I really suggest going and looking him up. He's pretty much the whole soul and center that I wrapped my artistic love around. So please go check him out. But this book is completely opposite from that, but I found myself absolutely fascinated by everything about it. Doing the research for this book was incredibly satisfying. For instance, learning about different kinds of automobiles was a joy for me, which was really surprising because I've never been interested in cars in my life. Automobiles at the time were descending from carriages, so the design was slowly morphing from the box shape of a carriage into the cars that we are familiar with today. Having a vehicle meant that more families could afford to move outside of the city, which were often cramped and dangerous, into suburbs where their families could spread out without losing the convenience of having their necessities close by like grocery stores. Car manufacturing created many jobs, and Henry Ford also leveraged for the 5-day work week we have now, so his workers could have weekends to use his cars. Previously, people were expected to work every single day of the week. Cars also created greater mobility for some upper and middle class women. Suffragettes, who helped us get the vote, used the vehicles to drive around and promote their message. Later, women used cars to find employment outside of the home. There were even early race car drivers who were women, so I thought that was a pretty cool fact. Working on this book, I was reminded that there are actually many ripples to everything. Where there's light, there's also dark. The invention of the automobile has done many good things for people, but life is not just black and white. Automobiles have now become so prevalent in our country that our cities are actually designed around them. There are very few walkable cities anymore, and I can attest as a person who lives in a very rural area, life has become car dependent for almost all of the American population. I can't go anywhere without a car. We now know that cars are a very large contributor to pollution, and they are very expensive for people to own and maintain. Car accidents for drivers and pedestrians is a major concern. Urban sprawl has become an issue for our environment, and there is a major disadvantage for people who cannot afford to own a car. For many people, if you don't have a reliable car, you will have a much harder time finding employment. There's also a dark side to many of our historical figures as well. Henry Ford is credited with shaping the world of mass production we have today. But in 1920, Lewis Marshall, Bob Marshall's father, tried to stop Henry Ford's newspaper from spreading anti-Semitic propaganda. It eventually led to a lawsuit brought by the Anti-Defamation League in 1927 against Henry Ford, and the newspaper was shut down. I highly recommend reading more about this at the AmericanJewishArchives.org and elsewhere. I'll put the description down in the, or the link down in the description box. I'd love to tell you a little bit more about Bob's father, since our parents shape so much of who we become. This information comes by way of the biography A Wilderness Original, The Life of Bob Marshall by James Glover. Lewis Marshall was a prominent constitutional and civil rights lawyer. He was also a very important leader of his Jewish community. You can see him here on the steps of Bob's house. He's the one with the briefcase looking at the viewer. Lewis Marshall was one of the founders of the American Jewish Committee, and he was a conservationist. He not only argued cases for the Jewish community, he also focused on cases for Catholics, Native Americans, Japanese, African Americans, and socialists. He often provided free legal counsel to these groups. He was active in the NAACP. He also championed a historic amendment to the New York State Constitution that stated that state-owned forests in the Adirondack and Catskill Mountains would remain untouched by development forever. This protected 600,000 acres from being timber harvested and from development. And of course, he was the one who fostered Bob Marshall's love of the forests. He would take him and his brothers and sister to a retreat in the Adirondacks every year where Bob was allowed to run wild and dream. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in the next time-lapse video. So this has just been a little slice of the story of Bob Marshall. In the coming weeks, I'll be releasing more videos like this, looking at a process of making the book and giving you a few more interesting tidbits I learned while researching. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you'll check the book out. It comes out September 5th, and you can pre-order via the link below in my description. Please also check out the other links in the description box down there if you're interested in learning more about anything I mentioned in this video. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the video in the comment section down below. Do you like this kind of video? Is there something you wish I would have addressed? Is there anything you're curious about? Please let me know. I'm just starting this channel and I gotta have that information to make it better. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.